Hey everyone, my name is Jennifer Beamer and I'm the owner and operator of Explicitly Dyed Art by Science. In this tutorial video, it's kind of like a method approach, and by what I mean is I have taken the dye process and I've walked you through my way of doing it, but this isn't the end all. So there's loads of different ways to go about dyeing. This is just how I dyed the wool that I used for my Tour de Fleece video for the Gulf Coast native. This video is designed to show you how to do a low immersion dyeing method called kettle dyeing. And there's loads of ways that you could take this in principle, use whatever colors you want, whether they're dye solutions or powders, although with caveat, with powders, please wear protection and clean all your surfaces really, really well, especially if you dye in your home kitchen. But this is just to give you kind of like a launching off ground. And even though I have been a professional dyer for many years, I still go back to this method for subtle variations in the base color, like a semi-solid that I'm going for. And so this video shows you what I did to create the colors that then got spun up for my Tour de Fleece. As with all tutorials of this nature, whenever I'm talking about dyeing, please use common sense, keep everything clean, wear gloves. It's fine to slightly overcompensate with protective gear if it makes you feel safe. If you're working with dye powders, absolutely have a NIOSH mask on so that you can block any of those fine particles from coming into your lungs. Do this as an adult, right? So if you want to wear gloves, I highly recommend wearing gloves. Some people don't. It's more than just staining. Your skin absorbs all that into your system. So I'm always really mindful of wearing protective gear on my hands. That part is up to you. You can wear a disposable kind. You can get like those latex ones that you wear when you're doing dishes. Have your surfaces covered. So in the past I used to use one of those big vinyl plastic party table covers because you could just wash that off and it's fine. If you do get any spills, clean them up right away. So I always have some rags that are only used for dyeing handy. All the dishes are always done whenever I'm dyeing, so I'm mindful of any kind of cross-contamination. Don't keep any open beverages around you, especially if you're working with dye powders. So yeah, safety is number one. If it helps, you can wear goggles while you're working with the dye powders, especially if you have sensitivities in your eyes, because the dye powder is an irritant, so you don't want that in your eyes. Once it's in the solution, you can be a little bit more loose. You don't have to wear the mask if you don't want to, but I typically dye with a window open nearby, or at least some kind of ventilation going so that any kind of steam doesn't accumulate in the house. Whenever possible, use tools. So if something is hot, try to grab it with something that will add as a barrier between you and whatever it is you're touching. I like to use tongs that only ever get in the dye bath. I don't use them for anything else. Chopsticks, before you've broken them in half, those are a really great tool. Old spoons, like old wooden spoons, or like things that you might find at a charity shop, you know, 25p or 25 cents in America. Just try not to work with it too much with your hands if you can avoid it. Same thing goes with like things like measuring cups, scales. If there is anything that you need to cover, you can use single-use plastic, although I highly recommend you just find ways to avoid single-use plastic as much as possible. So I think that's about all of the major caveats. I've used regular soap and I have had great success with just whatever I use with my dishes. As cleanup for both the spills and any kind of finishing step. So whenever I'm done dyeing, I always wash everything down. The sink, counters, stove, everything gets washed and then dried before I even start thinking about making dinner. Yeah, and it's really good protocol, including cleaning out your dye gear. Let's see here, what else? Never leave your dye stuffs unattended on the stove. I know this kind of goes without saying, but there's a tendency, because it might need to sit for a half hour so the dyes can absorb, you walk away and only check back in a half hour. Two things. One, if you're doing a low immersion method, which is what I'm doing in this video, there's not a lot of water, which you can boil off. And so you don't want anything to burn on the bottom. If anything goes not according to plan, you're there to catch it, right? Because you can see it. And then if there are issues with boiling and wool, you'll make felt. Without further ado, please enjoy this video, and I hope you have a great time dyeing as well. What I am showing you in this tutorial right now is me ballparking about how much wool I think will fit into this container, being mindful of the fact that the wool is going to compress a little bit once it's wet. So if it looks a bit full, that's pretty normal. Now, in terms of how to put it in there, there's lots of ways that you can prepare your fiber for dyeing. So what I'm showing you now is just chaining the wool roving together and placing that into the container in this particular way will actually leave some white spots in the wool. So if you want to do this more loosely, you'll just get a lighter color or value on those spots. You can also do this more tightly compacted, and that will give you more white spots rather than dyed spots. So basically you're using the wool as a resist through this chaining. Chaining is not actually necessary to do this type of dyeing, but I wanted to show you what it would look like if you did a loose chain and then dyed it. And in my case, I'm showing you also that you can combine small bits together. So this is a combed roving, and it didn't really have full continuous length, so I just kind of overlapped it and then continued chaining it together. So as I said, it looks really full, but I promise you it will all compact nicely into the container. So I'm just showing you another close-up here. There's some spaces in between, which is what I was going for. And as I said, you can make that more compact or less so, or skipping this whole chaining at the initial stage anyway. So this bit I'm showing you up close is essentially just what I was discussing previously. Now, the next thing you're going to have to do is submerge all of your wool in warm soapy water so that it can be wetted. Wetting the wool is really important because this does a couple things. First, it makes it so that the dye can penetrate within the center of the wool, and it will also help remove any kind of oils that were used in the spinning. It will remove any oils that were there from the carding and roving process, anything that you might have had on your hands. So if you had lotion on when you were touching it before, that can actually act as a resist. So just any kind of soap that you would use for washing your dishes, just a little drop, all you need to break the surface tension of the water so that the wool can be fully wetted. Now, over time, the wool will become fully wetted. You can also expedite it slightly by just gently pressing down, and this removes any air bubbles in the middle of your wool. So long as you do it gently and not repeatedly, this will not felt your wool. I've done this many, many, many times, and I've never had any issues. But if you are a production dyer like I am, pressing down on the wool like this just means that you can dye more quickly if you have lots of batches to do in a day. So you can do it or not. It's totally up to you. Just make sure that you don't repeatedly press up and down because you will felt the wool. I am using citric acid, which is food grade here. And while the wool has been removed, I've refreshed it with just plain clean water. And I'm adding enough citric acid to ensure that my wool will take the dye. And I'm just going to give that a little stir. And then, as you can see, I have just a little bit of water in there. I haven't really filled it up too much. And the main reason why I haven't is just because there's still some residual water in the wool itself. But I also want to make sure that I don't use too much water during this initial stage because I don't know how much water I will need to ensure that it's completely submerged but not floating in the water. Because when I do my dyeing stage, I'm going to be adding more water. So by starting off with a little bit of water in the beginning, I can actually monitor how much water goes into that initial stage. And so always think about less is more if you're going to be doing a low immersion kettle dye. And because I decided that this wasn't quite enough water, I am just adding a little bit of water that was the same temperature of the wool and also the water that went into the container initially. And I'm gently just pressing it down and seeing if there's any spots where the wool is sticking out a bit too much. Because I want there to be a little bit of water so there's a little bit of movement of the dye, but I don't want too much so that the dye stays where I put it. And so that I have some space overall for adding multiple passes of dyes. Now I'm going to be turning on these two burners. A quick note about containers, just make sure whatever container you use is heat safe. So I'm using aluminum here, which is fine to use in catering, so you can use those little burners that have the flame coming out. So if you've got something like this, it's fine with open flame. If you don't have anything like this, you can just do a normal sauce pot, just like one of those real big ones. Or you can even do a crock pot, but just be mindful that you can't use any of this stuff again if you're using acid dyes. If you're using food grade coloring, then it's fine. You can use it for your cooking and also for your dyeing. But since I am using professional wool dyes, I can't use any of this stuff for cooking ever again. Now I've added some yellow. And you can see that the dye is just sticking to those spots that I initially put it on. And I was using the tongs there to just push it and spread it slightly. And now I'm doing my first pass, which is sort of like a hot pink. And one of the things about dyeing that I absolutely love is in those initial stages, you might feel a little bit scared about using really bright, really saturated, punchy colors, but actually during the process of dyeing, you can subdue them through multiple passes of other colors. So in the final product, which you caught a glimpse of if you also saw my Tour de Fleece videos and also the episode on Gulf Coast native, this wool does not look pink and yellow, but that pink is really important for developing a more cranberry red. Now I'm doing another pass, this time with a sort of warm tone brown. Being careful to pour slowly. And another thing that you can do is, if you aren't too nervous about it, you can actually pick up and move the wool around a little bit. Just be careful about squeezing it too much or moving it too vigorously, because again, that will cause it to felt. If you aren't happy with the way the color is developing, using a neutral color like brown over the entire thing can actually help a little bit with evening out the tone. So if it is a little bit too bright for your liking, you can always add just a little bit of brown over the whole thing to just subdue the brightness or the saturation just slightly. And again, I'm showing you there where there's still a little bit of that pink, even though I've poured a bunch of brown on top. And now I'm doing this last pass with the red. Now, I didn't really have a strong idea of how this was going to turn out, but I wanted something that was going to give me a little bit of color variation with the yellows and the pinks, but also the brown. But I was generally aiming towards something that was predominantly red. Now I've covered the whole thing, and I'm simply rotating it because there's the smaller burner in the front and the larger one in the back. So to prevent too many hot spots, I am just giving it a whirl. This stage, it's been steaming for about 20 minutes, so I'm just checking the progress by lifting up to see how the color is being absorbed. And as you can see, it's mostly red at this point. There's still a little bit of red left in the wash water, so I know that this still has a little bit more time at this hot temperature to sit before it is completely absorbed. The final result, you can see some of the pinks and the browns, and because I did this chain ply, there are some spots in the middle which have absorbed the dye differently. So some of them are a little bit brown, some of them are a little bit pink, some of them are just lighter in color depending on which bit of the dye got splashed where. But overall, it is what I would consider a semi-solid. So there's a little bit where it turned out white rather than just a different color. And to sort of show you how it looks, one thing that I do personally is after I've dyed it and it's dried, I like to unchain it just so that I can see how the color is looking. Because sometimes you think, oh, it's too dark, or I don't think this is going to be good for my project. Recombining it back together just to see how the colors sit against each other can kind of give you an idea of what the final yarn will be. So I have to say this one turned out more red than I had anticipated. And this is actually one of the beautiful things about dyeing, is you can kind of customize based on experience what you like. So if I were to do this again, I absolutely would have tied this a little bit tighter And I would have used less of the red and slightly more of the pink in order to get more variation in the colors. And then if you really want to get a sense of how it's going to look if you've spun it up, if you re-chain ply it like this, the colors lie slightly differently. And because I've got a cat, of course, I set it down for pictures and turned away for a minute, and there she was. I did spin all this already, and so it was an interesting spin, but this also is a great step if you are thinking about dyeing this for a friend or for yourself or for sale. You should actually dye and spin your own goods just so that you understand how it works out. Because if it doesn't spin very well, it might not be great as a present. Now, I did do this as a Fiber Talk episode, so here's a shameless plug for that. So if you haven't seen it, please head over and take a look. Okay, so I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And let me know, did this help you with your dyeing adventures? Because I know when I first started dyeing, I loved this method. Everything that I dyed was with this particular method. I was really happy with the results, which is part of the reason why I'm sharing this with you. I know there are other creators who have this as well, but I thought I would contribute to the growing knowledge that is the fiber arts community. Bye! Thanks, Farah. Meow.